The story begins in Indianapolis on February 8, 1977. A man named Tony Kiritsis walks into a mortgage company called Meridian. He's got one arm in a sling and a box in his other hand. He's here for a meeting with M.L. Hall. The receptionist tells him to have a seat on the couch and wait. A few moments later, she lets him know that M.L. is actually in Florida right now. He was on a vacation. Tony says that can't be right. He has a meeting with him on the books. That's when M.L.'s son Richard shows up and tells Tony it was a last-minute work trip. But Tony knows exactly what's going on. M.L. is dodging him. So Richard takes Tony into his dad's office. The second they walk in, Tony shuts the door behind them. He pulls some papers out of his box and hands them to Richard. Richard thought these are land plans. But then Tony pulls a gun on him. He's also carrying a shotgun. Tony tells him this company has done him wrong. So he's going to let the world know what Richard and his dad did to him. He orders Richard to take off his coat and tie. Then Tony wires the shotgun directly to the back of Richard's neck, creating a dead man's wire. If Richard tries to run, it'll blow his head clean off. Right then, window cleaners show up outside the glass. Richard tells Tony not to worry. They can't see in from out there. So Tony picks up the phone and calls the police himself. He says, "Get me the highest-ranking officer you got. I've got a shotgun wrapped around a man's neck." Tony gives the police his full name. He tells them he is very concerned about this man's family. He treated this man's father like a father himself on many occasions. And that man treated him like a dog. But now he's got his son. Tony gives the police his exact address. He tells them he signed those papers when they cornered him. He's been trying for 4 years to get away from them. The officer on the line asks if they were a loan company or something. Tony says yeah, exactly. Tony's plan was to drive Richard back to his own place. But his key broke in the ignition on the way in. So they'll have to use Richard's car, which is parked a short distance away. Police cruisers start pulling up outside the building. Tony takes Richard downstairs. A police officer steps forward, and Tony tells him to stay calm. More officers are standing at the base of the building. Tony walks Richard right through the middle of them and out of the building. The police officers are exercising extreme caution. A news reporter named Linda picks up the information that there's police activity on a nearby street. A priest steps forward and tries to reason with Tony. Tony tells him it's Tuesday, not Sunday. That's when a police officer who actually knows Tony starts moving toward the scene. He tells Tony he's not armed. It's him, Mike Grable. They know each other. Mike suggests they go somewhere to talk. But Tony says no. They're going to Richard's car and then to his place. Right then, another officer rushes in and points a gun at Tony. Mike tells this idiot to put the gun down immediately. The news reporter is watching all of this unfold. Her crew starts rolling on everything. Tony asks a police officer for handcuffs. He's already noticed that the keys are still in one of the police cruisers. He cuffs Richard's hands together. Then he gives the officers his home address and tells them that's where he's headed. He tells the police to follow him so nobody has trouble with directions. Then he takes off in the police car. Linda calls her producer and fills him in on everything. The producer thanks her for being there but tells her they'll get the A-team on it from here. He wants her to come back. Linda doesn't like that one bit. She wanted this story, so she doesn't even tell the producer where Tony is heading. She takes her own crew and follows him herself. Police cruisers trail behind Tony the entire way. Richard is the one driving, his hands still cuffed. They all arrive outside Tony's apartment. Tony uses the car radio to talk to Mike, who's standing outside. Mike tells him they've got men inside his apartment. Tony fires back that that's a flat-out lie. Because if any of his men stepped foot inside that apartment, the whole place would be up in flames. He tells Mike he's bluffing. Tony says that after he and Richard walk into his apartment, Mike is going to get the chief down here to talk to him. Tony gets out of the car and takes Richard inside. Linda's crew captures every second of it. Once they're inside, Tony sits Richard down in a chair. He sets the shotgun on the table, propped up on a stack of books. Tony's also got a pistol in his hand. He ties Richard to the chair with rope. All of this was planned out ahead of time. Tony had everything set up and ready to go. The scene shifts to a radio DJ named Fred. Tony was a regular listener of his show, and even now, inside his apartment, he's got it playing. He feeds Richard milk from his own hands. Then he says he rehearsed this whole thing for weeks, and it worked. Outside, Police begin evacuating Tony's entire building. Police Chief Gallagher arrives on the scene. Tony spots a sniper climbing onto a nearby building. He shouts that he's got lines rigged to the glass. There are explosives in here. Tony turns to Richard and tells him he recognized the true value of that land. But Richard, his father, and the mortgage company deliberately drove the renters away. And he's sure of it. Right then, Chief Gallagher calls Tony on the phone. But Tony keeps talking to Richard. He tells him that he and his father sabotaged his land deal by scaring away renters. They drained him with loan interest and then tried to force him to sell cheap. Tony reveals he had planned to lease the land for long-term profit, but Richard and his father couldn't tolerate a small player winning. Tony gets on the phone with Gallagher and lays out his demands. He wants a written deal with his debt erased, compensation for his losses, his freedom restored, and a formal apology from Meridian Mortgage and Richard's father. Meanwhile, the whole city is watching Tony's story unfold on television. Reporters explain that Tony owned 17 acres of land that he wanted to develop into a shopping center. But the mortgage company steered buyers to other sites rather than recommending the one Tony had. Tony lets Richard talk to his wife on the phone. He tells Richard to tell her that he is truly sorry. Chief Gallagher calls Tony again and lets him know his brother is on the way. Tony lights up at the news that his brother Jimmy is coming. Then County Prosecutor George Martz gets on the line with Tony. He tells him they have a prepared statement that absolves his debt. Meridian Mortgage has already sent a notice to the county recorder's office. They tell Tony to turn on his TV. Meridian Mortgage's head of finance, Cliff Chapman, delivers a public apology on camera. But Tony's not satisfied. He asks where ML is. He says he wants the apology from him, not empty gestures from some nobody. Tony says how does he know these aren't just empty promises? He wants a lawyer of his own. Now Tony wants people to hear his side of the story. He calls that radio DJ Fred Temple. But Fred was just about to leave for the night. His associate stops him and says he's got a caller. Fred was heading out for dinner with his wife. His associate tells him that Tony Kiritsis is on the line, the guy with the shotgun on the man's neck. Fred rushes back and takes the call. Tony tells him it's an honor to talk to him. He asks if this is on air. Fred tells him no, but it's being recorded. Tony starts pouring everything out. He says these people betrayed him. They set him up in a scheme to ruin his life. He's a man fighting for everything he owns. Tony asks Fred if he has a family. Fred says he does. Tony tells him to imagine they set him up. Imagine they're going to take his car, his house, his wife, his children. Now, would he be ready to kill? Fred tells him he's going to stop the tape right now. He'll play it tomorrow morning. Tony says he'll be listening. Fred hands the tape over to the police. By now, Tony has refused to speak with the police at all. So the officers come up with an idea. Every moment Tony spends listening to himself on the radio or talking to Fred is another moment they have to formulate a plan. Fred agrees to help. He says if his talking to this man keeps that poor guy safe, then he'll do it. Inside the apartment, Richard tells Tony he needs to use the restroom. Tony ties him up inside the bathtub. The next morning, Tony's recorded phone call is aired on the radio. An FBI agent arrives on the scene. Tony goes and wakes Richard up. Richard turns down Tony's offer of food. Then a report comes through on the news that the Army bomb squad is on site and has started trying to figure out ways to get inside without setting off the explosives. Tony loses it. He storms over and screams for them to clear out away from the building. He calls Fred and tells him to pass the message along. Tell those officers to clear out. Tell his brother Jimmy or George Martz that he wants a live press conference on national television so he can talk to the people directly. Meanwhile, FBI profiler Patrick Mullaney starts questioning the other officers about Tony. He wants to know his psychological background. A man named Frank, who's known Tony for a long time, tells them he comes from a big family. He says Tony's the kind of guy who makes a great friend but also a terrible enemy. Everyone keeps saying he's out of control. He's lost his mind. But the profiler sees it differently. Based on what he's observed, the intricacies of that device suggest Tony is a man with serious attention to detail. He maps out Tony's emotional state. Tony is angry because he's been betrayed, disrespected, and humiliated. So the approach needs to shift. They need to give him respect. They need to give him the call he so desperately wants. They phone Tony and tell him they've got ML Hall on the line. But ML wants to speak with his son first and hear that his son is okay. Tony hands the phone to Richard. ML asks his son if he's hurt. Richard tells him he's hanging in there. He says Tony's a fine host, all things considered. Richard asks his dad if he thinks there's a solution they can sort out here. ML says of course. The lawyers are going to draft whatever contract. He and Richard just need to follow their lead. Richard tells him one of the main points is an apology. ML says there's no amount of sorry that's going to satisfy this man. He says he's sorry Tony missed payments and decided to commit a crime. Even with Richard pushing him again and again, ML refuses to apologize. He says he could say sorry 1,000 times over, but this is a recorded line. He's not going to admit guilt to something he didn't do. Tony grabs the phone and gets on the line with ML himself. ML tells him the Halls are stoic people, humble, God-fearing people. Tony fires back that they're greedy people. Their souls are pitch black. He tells ML to just apologize for what he did. ML says they're going to get this deal done. And Tony is going to release his son. Tony says what if he doesn't? What if he shoots pretty little Dickie here in the face? What then? ML's response is cold. He says he'll mourn the loss of one of his sons. Then he tells Richard to stay strong and hangs up the phone. When his wife questions him, ML says what is he supposed to do? He was on a telephone call with a madman. That night, Linda runs into Tony's brother Jimmy. Jimmy tells her it's not fair what the news folks have been saying. Linda tells him they'd be more than happy to give him the opportunity to set the record straight. Jimmy goes on camera and says Tony's not a desperado like he's been painted out to be. He's not asking for $5 million like some stations have been reporting. They've got an attorney named John on his way to help sort this out. Back inside the apartment, Tony is firing a rifle for shooting practice. Richard is locked in the bathtub. He starts hearing gunshots from outside. Tony is screaming. He stumbles in front of Richard, covered in blood. But it's all just a nightmare. The next morning, Richard and Tony start talking about their lives. Tony tells Richard he's got a luxurious life. Richard asks if Tony has any plans to be a father himself. Tony says his businesses are his children. He had his fair shot at love, but it didn't end well. Richard opens up too. He says being raised by his dad wasn't a walk in the park. He recognizes the financial privilege. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows growing up as his son. Everybody heard that phone call. The two of them talk about their mothers. To lighten the mood, Tony puts on some Fred Temple songs. Tony starts dancing. Richard can't help but laugh. Meanwhile, Fred is getting flooded with calls about Tony. Several callers are calling him a hero. Others are saying that finally somebody had the guts to stand up against these parasites. At the same time, Tony's brother and his lawyer are going through all the contracts that have been prepared. The FBI agent says the key is to make Tony feel like he has an audience. Chief Gallagher tells the team that if things go south, he's got a handkerchief in his coat pocket. If he pulls it, that's the signal. Mike's job is to secure the barrel and push it away from Richard toward the ceiling. And Chief Gallagher will draw his gun and kill Tony. Tony gets ready for the press conference. He asks Richard if he wants some cologne. Richard says it's been a long couple of days. He thinks they'll forgive him. During the live press conference, Deputy County Prosecutor George Martz reads a letter from the office. It's a letter of immunity granted to Anthony George Kiritsis. Tony watches it on TV and turns to Richard. He says the whole world is going to know who Richard and his father really are. And they're going to pay him $5 million for it. Tony hears police sirens outside. His phone rings. His brother Jimmy tells him it's all set. Richard asks if it's over. There's a knock at the door. Mike steps in and says they're ready. Richard asks Tony to take off his handcuffs. But instead, Tony wires the shotgun back to his neck. Richard tells him he's not going out there. Tony says don't try him. He'll shoot him right now. He drags Richard outside. Someone hands him a statement from ML Hall. Tony says Richard will read it. The two of them walk into the press conference. Tony declares that he's been called a kidnapper. But he's a goddamn national hero. And he wants this on all 3 national channels. He forces Richard to read the mortgage company's statement. But when Richard doesn't read it properly, Tony takes over himself so everyone can hear the truth clearly. The statement admits that a potential lessee was very interested in Tony's land, but the company refused the deal because it didn't serve their best interest. Tony points out that their interest was never fairness. It was profit. He says it's a private equity trap, meant to lure in common folk. And they're painting him a monster? He's just a little guy. For 4 years and 3 months, the mortgage company had one of these shotguns stuck to his ear. Now it's the other way around. That's when Chief Gallagher gives the signal. Tony, overwhelmed that all his demands have been met, breaks down. He thanks Fred Temple, who's standing nearby. Tony also apologizes to Richard's family. Watching it all unfold on television, Myha'la says Tony's the one holding the gun, and he's crying like a petulant child. His son has the gun strapped to his neck, and his eyes are dry as a bone. Tony thanks everyone and steps to the side. A commercial break cuts in on television. Tony's brother Jimmy tells him there are just a few last steps remaining. The moment Tony signs the papers, his face lights up with relief. Mike moves in from behind and, with Tony's permission, removes his rifle. The wire strapped to Richard's neck is finally cut loose. And just as Tony fires a shot into the air to prove the gun was loaded this entire time, police officers swarm in and tackle him. They're placing him under arrest. All of it was a lie. Tony's brother had been forced to deceive him. Richard walks away from the whole ordeal safely and reunites with his wife. His handcuffs are removed. Tears stream down his face from the sheer relief of it all. Tony is taken away in custody. On October 25th, the verdict comes in at his trial. Tony is tried and found not guilty by reason of insanity, a ruling that Richard doesn't agree with at all. On his way out, Tony looks straight into the news camera and says he is not crazy. Tony also receives a wave of public support from everyday people. Fred tells his radio audience that Richard Hall and Tony faced each other one last time after everything was over. They saw each other, but they didn't speak. There wasn't much more to say. And with that, folks, this story comes to an end. If you enjoyed this explanation, make sure to let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.